The morning of August 27, 1896, began like any other in the bustling harbor of Zanzibar, but it would end with the record for the shortest war in human history. The stage was set when Sultan Hamad bin Tuaini died suddenly under suspicious circumstances, and his cousin Khalid bin Bargash seized the palace in a brazen power grab that would prove to be the most catastrophic political miscalculation of the 19th century. The British, who had turned Zanzibar into little more than a colonial puppet state, had already handpicked their preferred successor, Hamoud bin Mohammed, a man so compliant he made lapdogs look independent. But Khalid had other plans, and his defiance would trigger a military response so disproportionate it bordered on the absurd. Let's be clear about what this conflict really was. The British didn't care about Zanzibar's sovereignty, its people's wishes, or any pretense of diplomatic resolution. They had treaties that essentially gave them veto power over who could rule, turning the Sultanate into a mockery of independence. When Khalid barricaded himself in the palace with around 2,000 defenders, the British saw an opportunity to make an example that would echo across their entire colonial empire. This wasn't about justice or international law. This was about demonstrating that resistance to imperial domination would be crushed with such overwhelming force that no other colonized nation would dare to follow suit. British Rear Admiral Harry Rawson assembled a fleet that included 5 warships, bristling with modern naval guns, positioned menacingly in the harbor like predators circling wounded prey. On land, British forces and their local collaborators totaled around 1,000 troops, armed with machine guns and artillery. Against this stood Khalid's palace guard, equipped with antiquated rifles, a single coastal artillery gun, and a wooden palace that might as well have been made of paper against naval bombardment. The disparity wasn't just unfair, it was deliberately theatrical, designed to humiliate and terrify. The British delivered an ultimatum with the cold, bureaucratic precision that characterized their empire. Vacate the palace by 9 in the morning or face annihilation. Khalid, whether driven by courage or foolish pride, refused to abandon what he believed was his rightful throne. Perhaps he thought the British were bluffing, that they wouldn't actually bombard a palace in the middle of a civilian area over a succession dispute. Perhaps he believed his artillery and the palace walls would provide some defense. Perhaps he simply refused to bow to foreign dictation. Whatever his reasoning, when the clock struck 9 and Khalid remained defiant, Rawson gave the order to open fire. What followed was less a war and more an execution by naval artillery. British warships unleashed a barrage of shells that tore through the wooden palace like it was constructed from matchsticks. The palace's single artillery gun managed to fire a few shots before being silenced forever. Khalid's defenders, many of them loyal civilians who genuinely believed in their sultan's claim, were slaughtered where they stood. The bombardment lasted approximately 38 minutes, though some accounts suggest it might have been as short as 35 or as long as 45 minutes. Not that the exact timing matters when you're reducing a building to rubble and killing hundreds of people in the process. The casualty figures tell the real story of this so-called war. Around 500 of Khalid's defenders were killed or wounded, their bodies buried under debris or cut down by shrapnel and gunfire. On the British side, 1 sailor was wounded, a single casualty. This wasn't a battle, it was a massacre dressed up in the language of military engagement. The British called it the shortest war in history, a quirky footnote that could be recited at dinner parties. They should have called it what it was: colonial brutality condensed into less than an hour, a demonstration that brown lives meant nothing when measured against British imperial interests. Khalid himself escaped through the back of the palace as walls collapsed around him, eventually seeking asylum in the German consulate. The British, having made their point with maximum bloodshed and minimum risk to themselves, installed their chosen puppet, Hamoud bin Mohammed, who would rule exactly as London dictated. Zanzibar's brief moment of defiance was crushed, its sovereignty reduced to an even more obvious fiction than before. The message was received across Africa and Asia. Resist colonial domination, and you'll be obliterated before your morning tea gets cold. The aftermath revealed the cynical mechanics of imperial power. The British demanded that the new sultan pay for the shells they had fired into his country, effectively making Zanzibar pay for its own subjugation. They dismantled what remained of the palace and strengthened their control over the island's lucrative spice trade. Zanzibar would remain under British domination until 1963, decades of exploitation justified by treaties signed at gunpoint and maintained through the threat of violence that the 38-minute war exemplified. Modern historians often present this war as a curious anomaly, a strange quirk of history, notable only for its brevity. This framing is comfortable because it avoids confronting what the Anglo-Zanzibar War actually represents: the grotesque power imbalance of colonialism, where European nations could murder hundreds of people in less time than it takes to watch a television show, then write the history books to make it sound like a legitimate military operation. The war is taught as trivia rather than tragedy, its victims forgotten in favor of marveling at the timestamp. Some apologists argue that Khalid brought this upon himself by defying the British ultimatum, that he should have known resistance was futile and surrendered peacefully. This argument assumes that colonial domination was legitimate, that the British had any right to dictate who ruled Zanzibar in the first place. It blames the victim for refusing to submit to injustice, rather than questioning why European powers believed they owned the world. Khalid's defiance, however doomed, was an assertion of sovereignty against an empire that had systematically stripped his nation of autonomy. The technological disparity also deserves scrutiny. The British arrived with modern naval vessels representing the cutting edge of military technology, weapons designed to project power across oceans and crush any opposition. Khalid's forces had rifles and a single outdated cannon. This wasn't a failure of military strategy. It was the inevitable result of centuries of European industrial development funded by colonial extraction, creating a feedback loop where stolen wealth built better weapons to steal more wealth. The 38-minute war was only possible because generations of imperialism had created such vast gulfs in military capability. The war also highlights how colonial powers manipulated succession crises to tighten their grip. Sultan Hamad's suspicious death was convenient for British interests, and while direct evidence of foul play is debated, the pattern is undeniable. Throughout colonial history, local rulers who proved insufficiently cooperative had remarkable tendencies to die suddenly, replaced by more pliable alternatives. Whether through assassination, induced conflicts, or exploited natural deaths, European powers shaped leadership across their empires to ensure compliance. Zanzibar was just one example in a global pattern of manufactured political transitions. What makes the Anglo-Zanzibar War particularly instructive is how it strips away the usual justifications for colonial violence. There was no civilizing mission here, no pretense of bringing development or ending slavery or protecting Christian missionaries. This was naked power politics. A sultan chose himself instead of accepting the British choice, so he was destroyed. The honesty of the brutality is almost refreshing compared to the elaborate moral frameworks colonial powers usually constructed to justify their conquests. The 500 casualties also raise uncomfortable questions about how we count victims of imperialism. These deaths happened in 38 minutes and made it into history books because of the war's brevity. But how many died in the years before from British economic exploitation? How many would die in the decades after, under colonial rule, from preventable disease, famine caused by cash crop policies, or simple poverty while Zanzibar's wealth flowed to London? The dramatic violence of the 38-minute war is documented, but the slow violence of occupation kills far more people in ways that never make it into trivia contests. The German role also deserves mention. Khalid fled to their consulate because Germany had its own colonial ambitions in East Africa and was happy to provide symbolic shelter as a way to needle the British. This wasn't humanitarianism, it was rival imperial powers playing games while Africans died. Germany would commit its own atrocities in Tanganyika, and Khalid was eventually captured years later when Germany and Britain stopped competing and started cooperating in their mutual project of African subjugation. Even his escape was just a footnote in European power struggles. Today, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is presented as a historical curiosity, the kind of fact that gets shared on social media with comments about how wild the past was. But reducing it to its duration erases its meaning. Those 38 minutes represented everything wrong with colonialism. The assumption that European nations had the right to control others, the willingness to use overwhelming force against minimal resistance, the complete disregard for non-European lives, and the transformation of atrocity into administrative action. The war's brevity doesn't make it quirky, it makes it more damning. The British didn't even need a full hour to kill hundreds and install their puppet government. The real controversy isn't whether the war happened or how long it lasted. The controversy should be why we remember it for its duration rather than its victims. Why it's taught as trivia rather than as an illustration of imperial violence. And why the British are never described as terrorists, despite using overwhelming military force against civilians to achieve political objectives. If any other group did what the British did in Zanzibar, we'd call it exactly what it was. But colonialism gets special vocabulary that sanitizes massacre into military operation. The Anglo-Zanzibar War lasted 38 minutes and killed 500 people in service of maintaining an empire built on exploitation. That's the story, not a quirky historical footnote, but a concentrated dose of everything that made colonialism monstrous, compressed into less time than a lunch break. The brevity shouldn't fascinate us, it should horrify us. An empire so powerful and so ruthless that it could devastate a nation before breakfast and be back to business as usual by noon represents the ultimate expression of colonial arrogance. The war that lasted only 38 minutes should be remembered not for its length, but for what it revealed about the machinery of empire and the cost paid by those who dared resist.